At 6:08 in the morning, a feed truck pulls out of the commodity bay at a Five Rivers cattle feeding yard in eastern Colorado. The truck carries 24 tons of mixed ration, steam-flaked corn, wet distiller's grains, alfalfa hay, and a vitamin-mineral premix blended to a formula that a computerized system generated before the driver arrived for shift. The formula is not the same as last week's formula. The corn price moved. The distiller's grain supply shifted. The nutritionist adjusted the blend overnight, and the mixing system incorporated the new specification into this morning's load without anyone manually recalculating the proportions. The truck stops at the first pen. 350 head of cattle stand waiting. The driver engages the conveyor and delivers the calculated quantity to the bunk in under 90 seconds. The truck moves to the next pen. This sequence repeats across 11 feedlot yards spread through Colorado, Kansas, Texas, Idaho, and other western states. Five Rivers Cattle Feeding, owned by JBS USA, operates the largest cattle feeding network in North America. One-time capacity exceeds 800,000 head. On any given day, somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 cattle are on feed across those 11 locations, moving through finishing programs that run 120 to 180 days from placement to harvest. The numbers define the scale. The system defines how the numbers move. The cattle feeding industry in the American West grew from two converging forces: the grain surplus of the post-war Corn Belt and the grassland ranching tradition that produced feeder cattle but lacked the feed resources to finish them economically. Feedlots emerged as the bridge between rangeland and processing plant, a finishing stage where cheap grain and efficient management could convert a 700-pound stocker into a 1,300-pound market animal in the time it took to turn over a crop. The western Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, the eastern Colorado, and the Nebraska Panhandle became the center of cattle feeding geography because these regions sat at the intersection of two critical resources: grain from the Plain States and water from the Ogallala Aquifer, which supported both the grain production and the feedlot water systems that large-scale finishing required. Five Rivers' footprint reflects that geography precisely. The network's 11 yards sit within or adjacent to the feeding region's historical core, positioned to receive feeder cattle from ranches across the mountain and plains states and to ship finished cattle to processing plants, including JBS facilities, within economical trucking distance. The integration between Five Rivers and JBS is not incidental. JBS, the Brazilian-based beef processing company that acquired Five Rivers as part of its expansion into the North American beef market, operates large-scale beef processing plants in locations that align with Five Rivers' yard geography. Cattle finished by Five Rivers move to JBS plants. JBS plants have a reliable supply of cattle whose genetics, feeding history, and health records are known to the processing team before the animals arrive. That alignment between feeding capacity and processing capacity represents the same vertical integration logic that drives food system consolidation across protein categories. When the feeding operation and the processing operation are coordinated under the same ownership, the scheduling, the cattle specifications, the health protocols, and the quality parameters all run as a single system rather than as negotiated transactions between independent parties. Procurement is where the network scale creates its most immediate operational advantage. Sourcing 800,000 head of feeder cattle requires buying animals from ranches across a large geographic area. Through a combination of direct ranch purchases, sale barn acquisitions, and forward contracts that commit cattle from a specific ranch or region months before the animals are ready for placement. The Five Rivers procurement team operates across multiple states, building relationships with ranching operations that consistently produce the type and quality of feeder cattle that the network's feeding programs are designed to handle. A feeder calf entering a Five Rivers yard typically weighs between 650 and 800 pounds at placement. It carries a frame size, a genetic indicator of mature body size, consistent with the carcass weight targets that JBS processing plants and retail buyers specify. Cattle that are too small frame never reach adequate carcass weight within economical feeding periods, while cattle that are too large frame may take longer than the optimal feeding window to reach the fat deposition level that carcass quality requires. The procurement team manages this specification challenge across a procurement geography that spans the Rocky Mountain ranching regions, the Plains states, and feeding areas in the Pacific Northwest. Feeder cattle from Idaho ranches move to Five Rivers yards in Idaho. Cattle from Colorado and Wyoming ranches move to Colorado and Kansas yards. How the network's geographic distribution allows regional procurement without the transportation distances that drive up cost and stress on incoming cattle. Incoming cattle receive processing, vaccination, parasite treatment, implant placement within the first 24 to 48 hours of arrival at each yard. The health protocols that govern this processing run consistently across all 11 locations, developed by the Five Rivers veterinary team and adjusted based on the health history and source region of each incoming group. Feed formulation is the technical core around which everything else in the network organizes. The computerized feed management systems running across Five Rivers yards do not operate independently at each location. They operate within a shared data framework that allows the central nutritional team to adjust formulas across multiple yards simultaneously when commodity prices shift, ingredient availability changes, or performance data from cattle on feed indicates that the current ration requires modification. The base energy source in Five Rivers' finishing rations is steam-flaked corn. Steam flaking, passing corn through a high-temperature steam environment before rolling it flat, disrupts the starch structure of the kernel, dramatically increasing the rate and extent to which cattle can digest the starch in the rumen. A steam-flaked corn ration achieves better feed conversion ratios than a dry-rolled or high-moisture corn ration, which justifies the capital cost of the steam flaking equipment that large feedlots operate continuously. The flaking density, the weight per bushel of the flaked product, directly affects digestibility and rumen fermentation rate. Target flaking density in most Five Rivers operations runs between 24 and 26 pounds per bushel. At densities below 22 pounds, the starch digests so rapidly that the rumen pH drops into ranges that predispose cattle to acidosis. At densities above 28 pounds, the starch remains partially undisrupted and digestibility falls. The flaker operators check density at regular intervals, adjusting steam pressure and roller gap to maintain the target. Wet distillers' grains, a byproduct of ethanol production, entered cattle ration formulations at significant levels following the expansion of corn-based ethanol production in the mid-2000s. The ethanol plants that process corn into fuel alcohol strip out the starch and return the remaining protein, fat, and fiber fractions as distillers' grains. For cattle, this byproduct provides a high-quality protein and energy source at prices that frequently undercut equivalent nutrition from soybean meal and additional corn. Feedlots near ethanol plants can receive wet distillers' grains by truck from facilities 30 to 50 miles away, incorporating a relatively low-cost, high-quality ingredient without the drying costs that convert wet distillers into the shelf-stable dry product shipped longer distances. The Five Rivers, Colorado, and Kansas yards sit within efficient trucking range of multiple ethanol facilities. The ration formulation systems incorporate current wet distillers' pricing and availability as a variable when calculating the least cost formula that meets cattle nutritional requirements. The system generates optimal ration specifications automatically when ingredient parameters are updated, reducing the margin between a price change at the ethanol plant and a formula adjustment at the feedlot to hours rather than days. Electronic cattle. Tracking across 11 yards and 800,000 head requires data infrastructure that would have been logistically impossible 20 years ago. Each animal entering a Five Rivers yard receives an electronic identification tag, a radio frequency identification device, or RFID, that links to its individual record in the network's management system. And that record contains the animal's purchase information, source ranch, purchase weight, purchase price, breed and frame assessment. It accumulates performance data throughout the feeding period, reimplant dates, health treatments and outcomes, periodic weighback data, pen moves, and it carries forward to the processing plant, where carcass data, hot carcass weight, yield grade, quality grade, returns to the feeding record and closes the loop on the full performance history of that animal. The value of this data accumulates at two levels. At the individual animal level, it allows the health team to track treatment history and avoid combinations that violate withdrawal periods or create other protocol conflicts. At the population level, it allows analysis of which source ranches, which genetic backgrounds, which placement weights, and which ration programs produce the carcass outcomes. High percentage of USDA choice and prime. Tight yield grade distribution, yield consistent hot carcass weights that JBS processing and retail customers require. Over time, this performance data allows the procurement team to differentiate between ranch sources whose cattle consistently perform above average and those whose cattle consistently underperform on feed conversion, health outcomes, or carcass quality. A better data on source performance allows procurement to price cattle more accurately, paying more for ranches with demonstrated performance histories and less for unknown or underperforming sources, which both improves the network's average performance and creates economic signals that incentivize ranching operations to invest in the genetics and management that produce feedlot-efficient cattle. The Penrider system that provides daily animal health observation at Five Rivers yards operates on the same foundational logic as at any feedlot. Experienced horseback riders moving through pens, reading cattle behavior, flagging sick or off animals for the health crew, but at a scale that requires careful management to maintain coverage quality. A Five Rivers yard with 80,000 to 100,000 head-on feed at one location might have 400 to 500 pens across its layout. A pen rider assigned to a section of 80 pens at 200 to 250 head per pen observes 16,000 to 20,000 animals per day on their section. The quality of that observation depends on the rider's ability to maintain attention and pattern recognition across a large number of animals, to remember the baseline behavior and appearance of pens that look normal, and flag the deviation when something changes. The health protocols that govern treatment decisions at Five Rivers run consistently across all 11 yards. When a pen rider pulls an animal for the health crew, the subsequent examination, treatment decision, and outcome recording follow a standardized process that the network's veterinary team developed and updates as new research, new products, or new disease challenges alter the optimal approach. The standardization across yards means that a treatment decision made in Colorado follows the same evidence base as a treatment decision made in Texas or Idaho, and the outcomes from both contribute to the same performance database. Bovine respiratory disease. The respiratory complex of viral and bacterial pathogens that represents the leading health challenge in newly arrived feeder cattle accounts for the majority of health costs in cattle feeding. The Five Rivers veterinary team tracks BRD incidents, treatment success rates, and mortality by source group, season, placement weight, and other variables that correlate with health risk. That analysis informs arrival processing protocols, which vaccines to give to which cattle, whether mass medication of high-risk groups reduces overall treatment costs, and guides procurement decisions about which source regions carry higher health risk at certain times of year. The geometry of an 800,000 head feedlot network creates logistical challenges that a single large location doesn't face. Coordinating procurement, feeding programs, and marketing across 11 separate yards requires a management layer that integrates information from all locations and optimizes decisions at the network level rather than the yard level. A procurement decision made in favor of a large purchase from a Wyoming ranch influences which yards receive those cattle, how those yards' pen space fills relative to the marketing schedule already committed to those yards' JBS plant connections, and whether the purchase fits the network's overall inventory position relative to forward sales commitments. The marketing function. Scheduling finished cattle from each yard to JBS processing plants on a timeline that matches the cattle's readiness with the plant's kill floor schedule operates on a rolling horizon of several weeks. The cattle approaching market weight at a Kansas yard need to be scheduled to a Kansas JBS plant on a date that the plant has kill floor capacity available. The cattle can't hold beyond their optimal harvest window without losing carcass quality and adding cost. The plant can't run efficiently without a steady and predictable supply of cattle in the appropriate specifications. The marketing team at Five Rivers coordinates this scheduling across all 11 yards and the corresponding JBS plant relationships simultaneously. A disruption at one plant, a maintenance shutdown, a labor shortage, a regulatory issue, cascades into the feeding schedules at multiple yards. Cattle that were scheduled to ship on Tuesday might need to hold another week, which shifts them past optimal harvest weight, which affects carcass composition and grade distribution, which affects the value the plant can extract from those carcasses. That interdependence between feeding program timing, marketing schedule, and processing plant capacity is the operational tension that runs through large-scale integrated beef systems. Managing it requires data, communication, and flexibility across the full chain. The feed ingredient sourcing network that supplies 11 feedlots spanning multiple states operates as a logistics system in its own right. The steam-flaked corn requires corn delivered to on-site flaking equipment at each yard. Kansas and Colorado yards source corn from the surrounding plains states, with grain elevator relationships and forward purchasing contracts that provide price certainty and supply reliability across the feeding year. The corn market's seasonal patterns, lower prices at harvest, higher prices as the marketing year progresses, create incentives for forward purchasing when harvest time prices support it, and which requires on-site grain storage capacity at each yard. Alfalfa hay, the primary roughage component in high-energy feedlot rations. Sources from irrigated production regions in Colorado, Idaho, New Mexico, and other western states. Hay quality, measured by protein content, fiber digestibility, and moisture, varies by cutting and growing conditions. The feed management system specifies minimum quality parameters for incoming hay. Data and procurement negotiates with suppliers to meet those parameters consistently. Sub-specification hay that falls below target protein or above target moisture affects ration consistency in ways that show up in cattle performance. Commodity byproducts, wet distillers' grains, corn gluten feed, cottonseed hulls, beet pulp. Source regionally from processing facilities whose locations and output volumes shift with agricultural production patterns. The Five Rivers procurement and nutrition teams track these ingredient markets continuously, adjusting sourcing and ration formulas as price relationships between ingredients change. At 800,000 head consuming 25 to 30 pounds of dry matter each per day, the network's daily feed demand approaches 20 to 24 million pounds. The supply chains that move that volume of ingredients to 11 locations across 8 states run as a continuous logistics operation without the option of pausing when markets are inconvenient. The JBS connection that sits above Five Rivers in the corporate structure changes the economic calculus of the feeding network in ways that distinguish it from independent feedlot operations. An independent feedlot operator buys feeder cattle, feeds them, sells finished cattle on the cash market, and captures or loses the margin between the cost of inputs and the market price of finished cattle. The input costs, feeder cattle, feed, and the output price, finished cattle, both fluctuate with commodity markets, and the feedlot operator has limited ability to control either. In years when the cattle feeding margin is favorable, the operation profits. In years when feeder cattle prices are high and finished cattle prices are compressed, or when feed costs spike, the operation loses money. JBS's ownership of Five Rivers changes this by integrating the feeding margin with the processing margin. The value that Five Rivers generates from the feeding program, converting feeder cattle into finished animals, doesn't transfer to an independent packing plant at the market price for finished cattle. It transfers to a JBS facility at an internal transfer price that reflects the integrated system's economics. The JBS processing plant captures value from converting those cattle into boxed beef and beef byproducts. The combined margin across both stages, feeding and processing, matters more than the margin at either stage in isolation. This integration creates operational advantages that the margin arithmetic alone doesn't capture. JBS plants that receive cattle from Five Rivers receive animals with known histories. Feeding program, health treatments, performance data, projected carcass characteristics from pre-harvest ultrasound assessments. That information allows the processing operation to schedule specific cattle to specific production days based on the carcass characteristics the plant needs for specific customer orders. Consistent specifications from a known supply source reduce the sorting and grading variability that a processing plant handling cattle from many independent sources faces. 8 western states, 11 feedlot yards, 800,000 head of capacity. The number requires geographical context to sit properly. Colorado, Kansas, Texas, Idaho, and adjacent states contain the land, the water, the grain production, and the ranching heritage that made large-scale cattle feeding viable in the American West. The Five Rivers network did not emerge from a single planning decision. It assembled through acquisition, investment, and the consolidation pressure that reshaped the cattle feeding industry across the 1990s and 2000s as the economic advantages of scale compelled smaller independent operations to either grow or exit. The network today is the accumulated product of those decisions. 11 yards, each with its own geography, its own regional feed ingredient market, its own procurement relationships with surrounding ranches, and its own connection to a JBS processing plant. They share a management system, a data platform, feeding protocols, veterinary standards, and a procurement and marketing function that optimizes across the full network rather than within each yard's boundaries. At 6:08 in the morning, a feed truck pulls out of the commodity bay in eastern Colorado. The same scene repeats at 10 other yards across the network. Different locations, different commodity mixtures reflecting regional ingredient markets, the same computerized formulation logic driving each load toward the bunk. 800,000 cattle eat this morning. They ate yesterday. They will eat tomorrow. The network was built to make certain of it. If this look at the largest cattle feeding network in North America gave you a better sense of how industrial-scale beef production actually operates, the procurement, the formulation, the data systems, the integration, hit the like button and let the algorithm find more viewers who want this level of detail. Subscribe for more stories that go behind the numbers of modern food production and the systems that move it. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Every location surprises us, and that never gets old.